The world was full of monsters, and they were all allowed to bite the innocent and the unwary. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me today. So today we are continuing in my series, The Buddhist Path in Fiction, Stephen King edition, and this is the fourth installment in the series, and today we're going to be talking about the book Cujo. I want to start by saying, and I'm probably going to say this at the beginning of every video because people may not watch all these videos in order, and it's kind of important to say, is that I am not making any claims that the author believes any of these things. I am going to be looking for different Buddhist philosophical or soteriological ideas in the text, but I don't think these are the beliefs of the author. In fact, the author will have themes that they want to explore, and they may overlap or coincide or be concordant with these ideas, but what I'm trying to do is not find out the specific meaning that the author was putting into this text, but instead I'm trying to model an example of what I like to call intimate reading, where I bring my full self to the text. In my case, that means over 2 decades worth of Buddhist contemplation and study and meditation. And by bringing my full self to the text, what I am hopefully doing is finding something in the text that gives me an opportunity to learn something new about myself and about the world around me. So these are different ideas that emerge for me as I read the text. And it may be a similar idea to a theme or a concept that the author is playing with, or it might be something as simple as I read a certain line of dialogue or a certain line of narration, and that sparks a separate thought or a jumping off point for me that it makes me think of something. Or at the very least, even if I don't find anything in the text, I always have how I experience the text, which is to say that I can look at if there's a character or an action that causes me to be frustrated or causes me joy, or if I have any sort of emotional reaction to the text, that's an opportunity to examine where did that emotion come from? What was it about this character's statement or this action or this bit of narration that caused me to feel a certain way? And so there's always an opportunity for me to explore myself within the text. So I'm not making any claims about what the author means in the text. I don't think that the author is putting any of these Buddhist ideas in the text intentionally. That is not my claim. But this is me bringing my full self to the text as a way of modeling intimate reading. With that said, up front, the video will have kind of 3 parts. The first part is going to be a summary or a brief discussion of the specific Buddhist idea that I wanted to highlight with this book. The second part will be a quick summary of the book, and there will be spoilers. I won't give any unnecessary spoilers. So things that don't need to be spoiled, I won't spoil. But you can expect the ending of the book at least to be spoiled. And then lastly, the kind of most important part of the video is the analysis. So once I have laid out some different Buddhist ideas that I want to think about, and I've given you a summary of the book, then I'll actually go into the book. Maybe I'll pull out some quotes or just some different passages and look at how that relates to these different Buddhist ideas and what came up for me as I was reading the book. As always, there are timestamps down in the description, so feel free to jump ahead to whatever section you want to jump to. As I mentioned in my introduction video, I wanted to structure these videos and these discussions around a series of Buddhist philosophical ideas or topics for meditation that are constructed in a specific sequence that we're taught as a way to encourage our deeper understanding and our meditation practice. And so I chose a book that hopefully has something to say about the specific topic that I brought up. Sometimes it's a stretch, sometimes it's going to fit perfectly. We're going to see how it goes. The Buddhist philosophical idea that I want to talk about today is the suffering of the lower realms. And maybe I will remind us of some context before I go into too much detail about that. As I mentioned in the very first video, the way these topics are organized is following the example of Atisha Dipankara. And this is a Bengali master who was at the monastery of Vikramasila in India, and then he traveled to Tibet in the 11th century. And he wrote a text that helped organize the teachings of the Buddha in a path of practice, right? And he wasn't the first teacher to do that, but an uncommon part of his organization was he defined what he called the 3 beings. And now we often translate this as the 3 scopes: the small scope, the middling scope, and the great scope, or we say a being of lesser capacity, middling capacity, and great capacity. And what we're referencing here is not their intelligence or their ability to practice, but rather the intention behind which they engage in these meditation practices. So a being of the small scope or of lesser capacity is a being whose only goal is for a positive rebirth. Middling capacity is a being who recognizes that as long as you're being reborn in samsara, you're still suffering. So their goal is to be free from samsara and to achieve what we say nirvana or liberation. And then the being of the great scope or a being of great capacity, realizes that being free from suffering for oneself alone is not enough, so their goal is to become a Buddha, to enjoy the perfect bliss and omniscience of Buddhahood for the purpose of benefiting others. So their goal is not to free only themselves, but to free all beings from suffering. And as Mahayana Buddhists, our motivation should always be lined up with that great scope. Our goal is to not simply help ourselves, but to help all sentient beings. Yet these meditation practices are divided into these three topics because we share them in common with those other types of motivation. And so right now we're still on the meditations that are shared in common with the small scope. First, we had perfect human rebirth. And the purpose of this is to realize how privileged we are and how the circumstances that we're in are quite uncommon, and therefore to motivate us to use our opportunities to benefit others and to engage in practice. And the second topic we discussed was impermanence and death. So once we have some conviction that we have these uncommon and privileged circumstances, then meditating on death and impermanence motivates us that it's important that we practice now because we don't know how long we'll have these opportunities. We don't have any guarantee that we'll continue to have these luxuries for any sort of indefinite time in the future. And so those first two practices are a way to become convinced of how privileged we are and the opportunities that are in front of us, and then to take hold of those opportunities and actually move forward. And now next, we focus on meditating on the sufferings of the lower realms. Now, as I said, a being of the small scope, their goal is to have a positive rebirth. So when you focus on the sufferings of the lower realms, it convinces you that the practices you need to do and the way you need to live your life is aligned in such a way that it will not cause you to be reborn in those lower realms. Now, I know for non-Buddhists, sometimes believing in rebirth is difficult. It's definitely an obstacle when new Westerners approach Buddhism and start studying Buddhist philosophy and soteriology. From my side, as a Buddhist, we actually believe that there are different types of rebirth and that we're being reborn as a human is quite fortunate, but you can also be reborn in the three lower types of rebirth, which are as an animal, as what's called a hungry ghost, or what's a hell being, or you can be reborn in the three upper types of rebirth, human, a demigod, or a god. And now, all of those types of rebirth, they're not permanent, right? There is no permanent type of existence. No matter which realm you're born in, that's a result of the karma you've created in the past. And then when that karma is exhausted, you'll take another rebirth, and it could be in a different realm. Hopefully, if you create enough good karma, then you'll always be reborn in the upper realms because that is the opportunity to practice dharma in a meaningful way. So we have to convince ourselves of how difficult it is to be reborn in the lower realms and how much suffering there is there to really make sure our practices only line up with virtue and only line up with the causes and conditions that would allow us to be reborn in the upper realms, specifically as a human in the future. Now, a lot of Westerners and a lot of kind of people that take Buddhism and maybe teach Buddhism light, they suggest that rebirth and especially the three lower realms are really exploring mental states of the human condition, that they aren't talking about actual types of rebirth. And so, as Buddhists, we actually say that's not correct. We are talking about types of rebirth, yet the way we understand them is through our human experience. So, we talk about the mental and emotional states and the suffering that exists in those realms, and we compare it to what it is like to be a human. And that's the way we're able to understand it. And in the context of this story, especially, I'm often going to be looking at the humans who have mental states that are parallel to what we might see in these three lower rebirths. That isn't the actual philosophical point that humans have these mental states that are like those of an animal or a hungry ghost or a hell being. Yet we can take that teaching of the suffering of the three lower realms and then apply it to our lives and see if we are living in such a way that's living up to our human potential, and if not, what we can do to then reverse that and pull ourselves out of the mindset that is shared in common with a lower state of rebirth. So in brief, we say that the suffering of the animal realm is one that is pervaded by fear and ignorance. And I know we look at animals, especially household pets or companions, and we think their lives are quite luxurious. But in truth, even watch your house pet, whether it's a cat or a dog, whatever, watch them eat their food. And as they're eating, they're always checking over their shoulder. There's always fear that something is going to come and take what is theirs. If you ever see a dog or a cat wake up from sleep, they can be in the deepest of sleep and then they're immediately alert in just a second because they always have to be on guard that something is going to eat them. So even the biggest predator always has a mind that is filled with fear, and we also say their minds are filled with ignorance. They're filled with unknowing, even the smartest animal. And I know that there are some primates and also some cephalopods that are showing types of logic system or a little bit of higher intelligence, but even the smartest animal, at least as far as we know right now, doesn't have anything even resembling the intelligence of humans, the capacity to use logic, the capacity to analyze your emotions, your emotional state, and so forth. So their lives are pervaded by ignorance. There is a consistent and constant unknowing in their lives. And because of that, they aren't able to change their circumstances in any meaningful way. They are just left at the whims of whatever circumstances befall them. Now, the next realm that we're talking about is what are called hungry ghosts. And this is a type of being who is, as the name implies, constantly hungry. There are a couple of different descriptions of hungry ghosts depending on the particular karma they have, but in general, they are wandering, searching for food and sustenance, and they can never find it. Their lives are pervaded by longing and by thirst and hunger, both physical thirst and hunger, but also emotional thirst and hunger. Always searching for what they can't find, right? Always despondent, never fulfilled, always unsatisfied. That pervades the life of a hungry ghost. And so that type of suffering is the one that is exemplified in that realm of rebirth. And then the last realm of rebirth are hell beings. And now hell beings, their lives are pervaded by pain, by physical pain and emotional pain, and by anger especially. Those are the two overwhelming types of suffering that hell beings experience. Both pain, physical pain, and the emotional torment of anger and maliciousness, which destroy all virtuous actions and intentions. So I'm not going to go on in any more depth about the three realms. That's what's important to know, is that each of those realms are pervaded by these different emotional states that are so overwhelming that it doesn't allow beings born there to actually access their capacity to engage in spiritual practice and to follow a virtuous path. And we can only understand it through our human experience, but you can trust that any human experience of these emotions is magnified many, many times for beings that are born in those lower realms. You know, my teacher, Kebje Lamazob Rinpoche, would say that if you could get into the mind of an animal, like your household cat or dog, for even 1 minute, your experience in that mind would be so terrifying that you would never again even go to sleep. All you would do is practice a spiritual path 24/7 to make sure you are never reborn with that type of mind. That is how extreme the fear and ignorance are that pervade an animal's mind. And the teachings say that if you were to take all of the fires that exist on earth and combine them into one, that would be like a single drop of flame that pervades the hot hell realms. So we have to use our experiences as humans and then magnify them and try to imagine them even more overwhelming. And that is what it is to be reborn in one of these lower realms, which is why we want to avoid it. Right now, as humans, whatever suffering we do have, even the most exorbitant or egregious of suffering, is still at a place where we can manage it in some meaningful way using our minds, and we can use that suffering to encourage our own practice. But in those lower realms, that isn't possible. Now, to give a very brief summary of the book. Now, Cujo was published in 1981, and if you think about it, not counting the Bachman books, before Cujo, you had Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, The Stand, The Dead Zone, and Firestarter. So all of those books involve some sort of supernatural element, and yet Cujo doesn't have any supernatural element, right? Which is one of the things that makes it so interesting in terms of King's early work. Now, you could say that the briefest description of the story is a woman, Donna, and her young son, Tad, are trapped in a car by a rabid dog, Cujo. There's a showdown. Who will make it out alive? End of story. To be a little more elaborate, the story is about two families. The first family is Donna and her husband, Vic, and their son, Tad, who is 4. The other family is Charity and her husband, Joe, their son, Brett, and their dog, the St. Bernard, the 200-pound St. Bernard, Cujo. And when I say the story is about those two families, that's true. You know, my book is about 420 pages. Cujo doesn't attack anyone until page 150, and the showdown between Donna and Tad and Cujo doesn't happen until page 206, so literally right before the halfway point. So all the space before that, we are learning about these families. And what King does so well is put you in a sense of place, especially when he's talking about small town and small town Maine especially. So this takes place in Castle Rock, which is one of King's go-to small towns in Maine. And what you're doing through the book is switching perspectives between these different family members and seeing how they experience the world. So those first 150 pages especially is doing a lot of work building your characters and understanding the dynamics between these characters and within the families, and then setting up all of the dominoes that have to line up in order for this final showdown to happen. So for instance, you know, Vic is away on business. He has to go away for a 2-week business trip, and that leaves Donna and Tad alone. Meanwhile, Charity and Brett are visiting Charity's sister, Holly, so they leave, and because of that, Joe takes the opportunity to also go on a little bit of a bender and a holiday as well. So when they show up at the Camber's garage, which is just at their home, there's no one there, but they don't know it. And so there are all these dominoes that have to be set up. And King does a great job of just setting up all of these things beforehand so that when the showdown happens, there are all these other elements at play that keep it interesting, that keep the story moving forward. And so what King does really, really well in this story is he develops character and he develops atmosphere. I think the pacing is really strong and really smart. And you feel for all these people, you recognize them, you understand who they are and how they are in the world. And even the characters that are somewhat antagonistic or villainous, you understand where they come from and how they happen to become who they are. So there isn't anyone that is mustache twirly. There's no overarching villain, and there's no supernatural force that is causing this dog to become evil. And in fact, King goes out of his way to really highlight the fact that Cujo is not the problem. The story opens before we get to our main characters with a story about a serial killer who had haunted Castle Rock just before Vic and Donna moved there. It was a cop who had gone bad and he killed a bunch of women and children before they caught him. And his specter haunts, not in terms of a ghost, but just is an emotional haunting for the town. And so he starts the story by pointing out how evil humans can be. When we first meet Cujo, he is yet to become rabid. And throughout the story, we often are in Cujo's perspective. And King does a really good job of humanizing this dog. And you see him before he became rabid, and then after he is bit by a rabid bat, and he's sick, but he still has some control over himself. And then when he no longer has any control and the rabies has kind of taken over. So you see this evolution in Cujo's thought. But the book ends with the reminder from King that Cujo was a good boy. All he ever wanted to do was help the boy and the man and the woman who he lived with. And when he went bad, it had nothing to do with his intention. It had to do with a sickness that he couldn't control. So King bookends the story by starting off by showing how humans can be dangerous and evil, and then ends with reminding us that even this dog who terrorized all these people was still a good boy, and he was acting outside of his own control. So King frames the story in that way, which I think is a really beautiful sentiment, and it shows King's soft touch and his understanding or experience of how we live in the world and what it is we should be afraid of. So now for the analysis. First, I think it's just useful to look at whenever we have Cujo's perspective and we realize that Cujo is all id. He has no impulse control, that even when he is healthy before he is bit, he knows that, for instance, he's chasing a rabbit. That's what causes him to fall down this hole to be bit by a bat. He knows that he's too old to chase a rabbit and he shouldn't do it, but he can't help himself. So you right away have this experience of not being in control of your emotions, being all id, being all impulse, and not having any logical brain that says step back from that. And then we see Cujo when he's sick, and when he's sick, he's trying. It's actually when Cujo is his most human, when he realizes something is wrong with him and he's desperately trying not to give into it, but he isn't able to. For instance, there's a moment where he growls at Brett, but then he hears Brett's voice and he switches back and realizes that Brett isn't an enemy. But there's no logic there. It's all pure emotion. It's pure experience only. As he's getting sicker and sicker, when the rabies has almost completely taken control of him, King says, Cujo was sick, and all things appeared monstrous to him now. His head clanged dully with murder. Just that idea, I think, is really powerful, that we become sick. We become sick with our emotions, with these overwhelming emotions where everything becomes monstrous, where we don't have control. Our perspective is totally shifted and we don't have the ability to see what is in front of us because our emotions are overwhelming us and blinding us to the nature of reality. And then as Cujo gets sicker and sicker, and as the rabies is even deeper and deeper into him, from his experience, whatever he encounters, he realizes that is the cause of his suffering. So when he sees Donna and Tad, he says, the woman, that one is the one who caused me all this pain. It's her fault. I have to get rid of her. And then a phone rings and he goes, that is the cause of all my pain. So it doesn't matter what is put in front of him. He's so overwhelmed by his pain that whatever he sees becomes the source of that pain. So just from the perspective of the animal, there is no impulse control. There's no logical deduction. There's no ability to look inside and say, why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? How can I navigate this in a healthy way? All there is giving in to id, right? And being overwhelmed by not knowing why you're feeling so miserable and unhappy and sick, not knowing why everything hurts, why nothing makes sense, why the people that you cared for now seem to be your enemies, not understanding any of that, but being afraid all the time that someone is trying to hurt you. And so the only way you can react is to lash out and to hurt them before they can hurt you. This is what we see in the animal mind of Cujo, and this is our animal mind as well. Now, what I realized during this reread is that we see similar things in the humans. All of the human characters become overwhelmed by their emotions and are acting more like animals than humans. For the most part, they aren't looking at their emotional experiences and trying to understand them. They aren't going inward. They aren't doing any sort of work. They're being led around by their emotions. And you see the different characters have different emotions that are pulling them through the story. Both Donna and Charity are overwhelmed by fear. Their lives are pervaded by a sense of unease, so that even when things go well, it causes them to be afraid, right? There are scenes where, Charity, the reason she's able to go on this trip to see her sister is because she wins the lottery. And even winning the lottery causes her to be afraid because Joe is abusive and not a great husband. And she doesn't know how she's going to be able to tell him and convince him to allow her to go on this trip. So even when good things happen to her, it terrifies her. And now she is able to make a logical plan to try to get Joe to go along with her. But her first instinct is to cower in fear, even when good things happen. And to some extent, those good things make her fear even greater because they show her a little bit of what her life could be if she didn't have the circumstances she has. And so when good things happen to her, they actually exacerbate her fear and her despair. For the first time in her life, maybe for the only time, that heavy muslin drape of the everyday had been twitched a little, showing her a bright and shining world behind. So seeing that bright and shining world and realizing she doesn't have access to it just causes her to despair even more. And you could say similar things about all the characters. Vic, his there are troubles with his business, which is why he goes on this business trip. And so his life is pervaded by confusion and fear and distrust because he finds out that his wife has been unfaithful to him. And that causes great feelings of anger and great feelings of shame as well. And then more fear because he's worried about the state of his marriage as well as the state of his job. Donna, as I said, is filled with shame and fear. Charity is constant fear and terror. Everything she does is born from a place of fear and terror. Joe and his friend Steve, who lives down the road, their lives are filled with petty grievance and anger and violence and just a sense of brutalism that there's nothing good in this world except what I can take from the world. So those emotional states color everything they see. And then the two children, Tad, who's 4, and Brett, who is 10, their lives are filled with constant uncertainty and fear as well. Both of them realize that their parents are having some sort of problems, and so that causes uncertainty and doubt in their minds. And then on top of that, Brett realizes at some point Cujo is sick before he leaves on his vacation. He doesn't know what is wrong, and so their whole lives are also pervaded by fear. And so all of the examples of the humans, especially before we start getting this interaction with Rabid Cujo, is these humans are living their lives as if they were animals, that they aren't doing any work to analyze their emotions. They're letting their emotions, their id, all of these unhealthy thoughts lead them around. So they have no control over their lives. They're not doing any sort of internal work that will allow them to take control over how they experience the world. Now, there are some counterexamples to this, which just highlight the importance of having some sort of control over your emotions. One of them is when she is trapped, Donna is able to use logic and try to make a plan to figure out the best way she can get out of the situation, what she can do to keep her and her son alive. But then she'll have these moments of insecurity and doubt and fear, which cause her to lose track of all of her plans. So you see these moments of really engaging in the capacity of a human and using logic, using intellect to look inward and say, what is it I can do to navigate these difficult circumstances? To use logic, to use reasoning, to look at my own mind and see how my mind is causing my obstacles. So you have those, but then they're overwhelmed by her fear and her insecurity. The other good counterexample is Vic when he finds out that Donna has been unfaithful. At first, he feels this extreme sadness, but then from sadness comes shame and self doubt. And then from there comes anger, both at himself and at Donna. And he knows that this is not a healthy way to live. And so instead of going home, he goes to the park and he spends hours just contemplating how he's going to react to this. So there is a really great example of realizing that your emotions are overwhelming you and recognizing that if you act on those emotions, that all you're going to be doing is causing destruction, right? You're going to be causing pain for yourself and for others. So then taking the time to step back from your emotions and try to analyze, where do these emotions come from? Are these emotions helping me or not? Are they harming me or not? How can I navigate these emotions, which isn't to say reject them, which isn't to say that my experience of anger and shame and fear and distrust and betrayal, those aren't invalid. right? But that they aren't beneficial to me. So I have to be able to look at them and then accept them and then try to find a way to move beyond them so they aren't controlling my life. So they aren't controlling my actions, but instead I am controlling my actions. So we do have this good counterexample in Vic analyzing how he's feeling after he finds out that Donna has been unfaithful to him. But for the most part, we see these humans as they're acting like animals, as they're allowing their minds to be pervaded by these different emotions. And then instead of analyzing those emotions, they are just being led around like a bull through a ring in his nose. So for the most part, that is how I see the suffering of the three lower realms really coming into play. Seeing both the animal and the humans live lives that are overwhelmed by these emotions and then not taking the opportunity to analyze those emotions. And therefore, their lives are filled with this type of suffering that they don't have any way out of because they're acting like animals, because they're not using the capacity as a human being to use your intellect and your reasoning. And so seeing all of these things is just a reminder of how overwhelming it would be to be reborn in one of the lower realms. To be more broad and focus on other Buddhist things or other ideas that came up for me in reading, I think going on with the idea of having overwhelming emotions is really useful. There are a number of little scenes that just reminded me about how important it is to recognize our emotions before they overwhelm us. I think the first one is when we're following Cujo, and King says dogs have a sense of self consciousness that is far out of proportion to their intelligence. I think that is actually a really profound way to understand things, in that most of us have that. Most of us, the idea of who we are, our sense of self, is not concordant with how we actually exist in the world. Now, that's not saying that we think we're more important or we have this egregious ego that says that we're better than everyone. But what it is saying is that understanding how we exist in the world, understanding what it is that shapes us and what effect we have on other people is something we often don't realize. Our egos often do take control, and they say that I am the most important in the world revolves around me, and therefore anything that can cause me any sort of harm or discomfort, I have to fight against, and anything that might be causing me some sort of benefit or gain or praise is something I have to run toward, right? And so that self-cherishing mind is so overwhelming to us that it causes us to engage in all sorts of harmful actions and therefore is the cause of so much of our suffering, not understanding our sense of ego in relation to how we actually exist in the world. Similarly, with the affair that happens, you see the fickleness of lust and attachment, and how attachment and lust, they don't lead to happiness. They lead to momentary gratification, but then that very quickly transforms into destruction. It transforms into suffering. And that is displayed really, really clearly here. How lust and attachment don't have any value in and of themselves, but they lead you down a path of despair. Similarly, there's a scene later where there is an act of vandalism. And when that person is engaging in that act of vandalism, he actually has an erection. And the distinction between violence and sex is blurred, right? Because those emotions, the anger and the lust, are so overwhelming that they merge into one and they cause him to lose his sense of being. He says that he was in a dark hole. There was no logical thought. Part of him knew that what he was doing was going too far, and yet he was in a dark hole, just like an animal, where his anger and his lust overwhelmed him, so he had no control over his actions at that point. He was all id. I think meditating on how we can have the sickness of overwhelming emotions is really useful, and how it can cloud our thoughts. And there's a great line, and this is talking about the actual sickness of rabies as it descends on Cujo, but I think it's applicable to how we experience the world. The sickness had tightened down on him, sinking into his nervous system like a ravenous grass fire, all dove-gray smoke and low rose-colored flame. As he's overwhelmed by this disease, everything is burning. Everything is out of control, right? He has no ability any longer to engage in reality. All he can do is engage in the pain and anger that come from this burning sickness, from this emotion that is overwhelming him. He goes on to say, in his madness, he heard the real and the unreal. When you are overwhelmed by your emotional states, then you are not reacting to reality. You're reacting to your projections of reality, to your interpretation of reality. The idea that when Cujo was overwhelmed, he was in his madness, he heard the real and the unreal. How often do we do that? How often do we react to slights or harms that we think others are giving us, but it really wasn't their intention at all, right? We are reacting to these things that we've made up all the time. And that is the case for almost all of our emotions. We are reacting to projections, to hallucinations. We're not reacting to the reality that we're actually living in. That is because our emotions blind us to reality. And our emotions create this facade of what we think is reality. And as we react to that, all we're doing is tilting at windmills. We're not actually doing anything meaningful. We're letting ourselves be riled up by hallucinations. Because in our madness, we hear the real and the unreal at the same time and can't distinguish them. Something King is always good at is laying on nostalgia kind of thick. And here he uses that nostalgia to highlight fear and to highlight insecurity in a really, really beautiful way. So this is while Donna and Tad are trapped in their car. She remembered the childhood games of hide and seek that had always ended when the shadows joined each other and grew into purple lagoons, that mystic call drifting through the suburban streets of her childhood. Talismanic and distant, the high voice of a child announcing suppers that were ready, doors ready to be shut against the night. Hallie Allie in free, Hallie Allie in free. The dog was watching her. It was crazy, but she could no longer doubt it. Its mad, senseless eyes were fixed unhesitantly on hers. No, you're imagining it. It's only a dog, and a sick dog at that. Things are bad enough without you seeing something in that dog's eyes that can't be there. She told herself that. But the dog was looking at her, and there was something familiar about it. King takes his opportunity to play with your nostalgia to remind you that things weren't always so complicated, that there are times when you were just engaging in the reality of dinners being ready and doors being closed to the night where you could be protected. But now, since you're overwhelmed, you don't have that protection anymore. Since you are chasing hallucinations, you don't have that protection anymore. Since you don't have any control over your emotional state, you don't have that protection. So that is the first thing that really jumps out to me in this book is our ability or inability to navigate our emotional states and how we need to do that if we want to claim our prize as humans, if we want to be able to be in control of our lives and not live life like an animal or a hungry ghost or a hell being. If we want to be able to live our life with the dignity of being a human and to use our life in a meaningful way, a big important part of that is taking control of our emotions. And over and over and over again in this book, that is explored. Now, another thing that jumped out at me in this book is the idea of coincidence. All of these dominoes had to line up, as I say, in order for Donna and Tad to be trapped in the car and for the events to play out like they do. And King lines them up all perfectly to the extent where you don't ever feel like they're forced. Everything makes sense, right? And so all of the tragedy that befalls her, you see it putting into play. You see him moving all the pieces. You never feel like you're being manipulated, which is just a testament to how well he writes. And the characters themselves are constantly thinking about this coincidence. At one point, Donna thinks it's like a chain reaction that doesn't stop anyplace, and it's gumming up works I didn't even know existed. And so for me, thinking about all these coincidences and seeing all these things put into play that then have results down the line bring up two different ideas for me and two things to think about. The first one is simply karma, that everything that happens to us happens due to causes we have created in the past, and we can't escape our karma. Now, I'm going to talk about karma more in a future video, so I won't go into too much detail here, but karma can be circumvented. So when you've created negative karma, you can purify it. That's the language we use, but that's really taking away its ability to ripen. And the same thing for positive karma. When you create positive karma, that can be disempowered by moments of anger and so forth. However, everything that happens to us and all of our experiences are a result of actions we've done in the past. So what looks like coincidence is actually the result of numerous actions we have taken, we'd say in past lives as well as in this life, and all of those actions having small, minute results, and those results lead to our experiences in this life. And now we have the ability to then navigate those experiences in a healthy way. We have free will. We have the ability to change things, but what we're experiencing now is a result of what we've done in the past. So we can't control what we experience now. What we can control is how we react to it. So there's no such thing as predetermination. There's no such thing as being a slave to fate. But what there is the natural result of actions that we've done. And from the outside, it looks like coincidence. But from the inside, what it really is we have created the causes and conditions for us to experience this circumstance and this emotional reaction to the circumstance. And so now we have the opportunity to use these circumstances to create positive causes so that in the future, we won't be experiencing whatever these negative outcomes are. So all of these coincidences, for me, they first made me just think of karma and how karma is definite. And from the outside, karma may look like coincidence, but it is actually a definite process of cause and effect. The other thing it made me think of is this idea of interdependence, that everything is dependent on something else. Nothing exists in a vacuum. And so, in order for events to happen, they have to be related to other events. For us, the way we understand interdependence is we often talk about the 12 links of interdependence, which shows how one action can cause a type of karma that then causes a chain reaction of us being born into a future rebirth, and then due to that, we develop certain types of minds. Those minds cause us to engage in certain types of actions. Those types of actions cause us to create more karmas and so forth. They create a wheel, the 12 links of dependent origination. And so nothing exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists without causes and conditions. So just seeing all these coincidences line up made me think very strongly of both karma and also interdependence, how everything happens due to causes and conditions that we have created in the past. From the outside, it may look like coincidence, but in truth, it is the natural effect of how we exist in the world. So this book gave me a lot of good opportunities to contemplate karma as well. Another thing that came up a lot is the importance of relationships. And what I mean by that is, the almost supernatural elements of this book, the parts that could almost be leaning towards supernatural, is it almost seems like there is a psychic relationship between the characters. So for instance, when Vic is away on business and Donna and Tad are trapped in the car, he has nightmares about them being stuck somewhere and being haunted by a monster and him not being able to save them. And similarly, Brett, when he's away with his mother, he has this experience where he starts sleepwalking again, which he hasn't done for years. And in his sleepwalking state, he imagines that he is feeding Cujo, but Cujo isn't hungry anymore. Numerous times, there are dreams that one character is having about another. And there are similar situations where it seems like the connection between them is almost psychic. In truth, you can understand it from the human events of their lives, so there isn't anything supernatural going on. But it did, for me, highlight the importance of connections and the importance of having relationships with other people. Now, obviously, we say that what is most important is your own mind. But the reason we're engaging in this practice is so we can help others be free from suffering. And in a very worldly sense, that means having relationships with others. And especially for lay people, people who have a family, people who go to school, who go to work, who engage in everyday life, they have to develop meaningful relationships. And so King's exploration of relationships, I think, is really beautiful in this, because you see relationships that are very loving and kind, and you see relationships that are harmful. You see relationships that are based in fear and mistrust and not in any sort of valuable or virtuous mindset. Those relationships can either be uplifting or poisonous. There are numerous points throughout the book where the importance of relationship is kind of stressed to me. And so it just really made me think of what it means to be in relationship to others and how that can empower your practice. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a tradition of doing solo retreats that last 3 years. 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days. You go on retreat and you have very little to no contact with anyone, except for maybe the people that are bringing you supplies. There's another type of retreat that isn't done as much now, but it's called a mud retreat, I believe, where you actually go into a cave and they seal the mouth of the cave, only leaving a hole big enough to make sure that you can get oxygen and that they can pass provisions in and they can take your waste out. And they may be years in a cave doing that retreat. So there is this tradition of being isolated. Yet, that isn't how most of us live our lives. We live our lives in community. And so there is an importance to developing meaningful relationships that are based on trust and on virtuous mindsets, not on distrust, not on lust or attachment, not relationships that are bound up in jealousy or in anger, right? So just seeing the connection between these different people and the way relationships cause them to behave in certain ways, both virtuous and non-virtuous in the story, it gave me really great opportunity to contemplate what it means to live a life where I'm focusing on purifying my mind, focusing on perfecting my mind, my ability to be of service to others. And how can I be of service to others if I live in isolation from them? Another small thing that jumped out for me is how very small things can have outsized impacts. When Donna and Tad first confront Cujo after he's become rabid, she gets out of her car, not realizing that there's a rabid dog to attack her. And he runs at her. She manages to make it back in the car and close the door, and he leaps at her window. But luckily, her window was closed. The only reason it was closed is because she has the habit of rolling up the window before she gets out of the car, a habit that her father had instilled in her since she was a small child. And she says that one action, that small action of rolling up my window, which I didn't even think about, that small action is all that saved me. Because if I hadn't done that, he would be in the car with us. We often think that our small actions don't matter. We don't think about the fact that it's a tiny acorn that grows into an oak tree. And so our actions, no matter how small, can have outsized effects. And that goes for both virtuous actions and non-virtuous actions. And so that's something I stress a lot in my teaching, how important it is to make sure every one of our actions is as intentional as it can be, and that it is motivated with a positive mind. Because the smallest of actions can be multiplied many, many times before its result comes to fruition. One of the examples I gave, a very worldly example, and an easy way to kind of wrap your mind around it, is if you've ever meditated, it's very common when you meditate to put your hands on your lap, right? To let them rest maybe on your thighs or on your knees. And you'll see if you let your hands rest where they naturally rest, then at the end of your meditation, you'll be more or less comfortable. But if you force your hands even a few inches forward so your arms are tighter, or you pull your hands back so they're closer to your hips, so they're not put in their natural position, then maybe only a few inches of difference. But if you meditate that way for a half hour or for an hour, you're going to notice your shoulders are in a lot of pain. And it may not be immediate, but you might wake up the next day. And all it is a few inches difference in where you put your hands that determines whether you are in pain or not the next day. And so that is a good real world example to remind ourselves that small actions have outsized effects, or at least they have the capacity to have outsized effects, which means we should always make sure our actions are virtuous and pure and that they're done with the intention of benefiting others, that they aren't motivated by self-cherishing mind. So there are a few instances in this book where you see people make very, very small decisions, and those small decisions have consequences that seem incredibly disproportionate to the decision they made. And I think that that is a good reflection of reality. There are also some instances in this book that I think force us to think about perspective and how we see the world, and how the ways we experience the world isn't necessarily how the world is. And so there are two instances that come to mind in the book. The first one is when Charity and Brett go to visit her sister, Holly, her younger sister. Now, Holly has made it out of Maine, and she managed to marry someone who then went to law school and became a lawyer, so they're somewhat well off. Whereas Charity and Joe and Brett are not doing well financially. They live out in the sticks, and they're always scrabbling for money. And before Charity goes to see Holly, she hasn't seen Holly for years because Joe wouldn't let her leave, basically. So when she goes to see Holly, she has all these ideas about how wonderful a life Holly has and how she wants her son to be influenced by Holly and her husband. But slowly, her perception of Holly starts turning, and she thinks Holly is obsessed with money, and she has all these negative experiences of Holly. So all this Holly she had built up in her mind, and then when her self-cherishing mind starts mixing in with that, she begins to see Holly in a whole different way. But then you get Holly's perspective, and she looks at her sister with nothing but pity and disgust. And she says, how could you stay there? How could you not let yourself get free from the horrible torture that was our childhood? So the two of them are looking at each other, and they're putting on the face of being loving sisters who haven't seen each other for such a long time. But inside, they are resenting each other. And they're resenting each other because what they see reflects their worst experiences back to them. And that is all due to perspective and projection. It doesn't have to do with reality. It isn't an honest examination of the world, but it is examination of your hallucination only, and not realizing it's a hallucination. Another great example of this is when Donna is trapped and she is trying to hear where Cujo might be. She talks about, Donna, before they moved to Maine, they lived in New York. And she said how she first had city ears, and now she's been able to develop town ears, but it's taken quite a long time. But where they are, out in the boondocks, you need country ears, and she hasn't developed those. And that is just the distinction between what background noises you hear and your ability to focus on different sounds in your environment is different depending on where you come from. She is just talking very practically about living in a city. You're able to ignore so much background noise. And then when you get in the country and things slow down, obviously what you're hearing is different. Your background noise is entirely different. And so for her, being in the country feels entirely silent, even though there is a lot of noise going on. She just doesn't have the ears to recognize the situation because she isn't used to it. So we all get trapped in our habits. We get trapped in our patterns, right? We develop a blindness to how we exist in the world. And we only can become aware of that blindness when our circumstances are radically changed. So when our city ears are put out in the country, that's when we realize that we have been trapped in one way of experiencing the world, and that way isn't reflective of the world at large. So I think the power of perspective is really important, and the power of perspective versus projection, and how we see what we believe to be reality, but what it really is our own habits and our own kind of insecurities that are being projected outwards, and our own ignorance, our own misunderstanding of the world. And that's what we're engaging with. due to our warped perspective. And then the last thing that came up in this story that gave me pause is there are numerous times where we talk about the power of the mind. You see Donna, when she's freaking out because she's trapped, insisting, don't go down that way. Don't think about those things. Only think of the positive. So at first, she wants to think about the fact that the mailman is going to be coming soon. And so as long as they can last until the mailman comes, then they'll be saved. And whenever she starts thinking of the mailman, immediately her mind drifts into everything that can go wrong. And so she's constantly trying to convince herself not to think of the negative, which is just a reminder of how powerful our mind is. Our mind creates our reality in many ways because our mind is what shapes our experiences of the world, right? Our mind doesn't create the physical circumstances that we have, but it does shape how we respond to them and how we experience them and how we understand them. There's one point where Donna compares her mind to a garbage disposal that is working in reverse, that no matter when she tries to focus it, all it's doing is bringing up the wrong things. And this is especially when she's been trapped for a while, so she's suffering dehydration and she's overwhelmed all of her senses. And so you can see that our mind is the most powerful thing we have, and it causes most of our suffering because we aren't realizing that our suffering and our happiness come from our mind. We think they come from outside of us. So we're constantly grasping at external circumstances as if those are what are going to bring us happiness and or suffering. But the truth is, our happiness and suffering come from the way we react to those circumstances. So our mind is constantly acting like a garbage disposal that is working in reverse, that instead of taking in things and analyzing them and making sense of them, it is spewing out garbage. And that garbage we are interpreting as if it were real. We're letting that garbage infect our minds, and that garbage then causes us to have these oversized emotions that we aren't dealing with in any way. And so all we're doing is creating more suffering for ourselves over and over and over again. And that's all due to the power of our mind. And the beauty of realizing that is that's something we can change. That is something we have control over if we exert the effort and the practice and the will to control our minds, to become familiar with our minds, to not let our minds become overwhelmed. Another moment like that where you can just see how the world focuses into the smallest thing due to the power of the mind is while she's trapped. At one point, Donna thinks, nothing mattered, nothing was but this silent and sun-struck dooryard where death had been dealt and yet more death waited in the cards as sure as aces and eights. The old monster kept his watch still. Our mind has the ability to focus on a single thing, and that can be good or bad. Now, it's good in that we need to use that ability in order to develop positive and virtuous minds, to make our minds inseparable from compassion and love, to make our minds infused with wisdom all the time. But that propensity, if we don't control it, can also be bad. When we focus on the monster keeping his watch, when we focus on the negative, when the power of our minds betrays us because we haven't done any work to control it. The old monster kept his watch still. That has nothing to do with a dog. It has to do with us focusing on fear and despair and not realizing that we're in control of how we engage with the world around us. We're in control of navigating our experiences. We aren't in control of what happens to us physically, our physical environment all the time. We aren't in control when harmful things happen to us, but we are in control of what we focus on and how we use our mind to always react in a virtuous and beneficial way, a way that makes the most out of whatever opportunities we have. So the power of the mind, especially a mind that is being overwhelmed by fear and distress and pain, I think is something that I saw repeatedly in this book. And it's something that gave me a lot of opportunity to think about, and how our mind is our true refuge from this kind of suffering if we recognize it and empower it and lean into it in meaningful ways. Okay, I have rambled on and on and on and on. This book, I think, was a little bit softer analysis than my last two, but what I tried to do is organize it instead of just chronologically in the book to these different ideas, these different themes. And so I went through them somewhat quickly, but for me, those are all different topics that have a particular Buddhist flavor, or at least there is a particular Buddhist interpretation of them that this book gave me opportunity to think about, to dwell on, to contemplate. The idea of oversized emotions, the idea of being slave to our id and to our impulse and not realizing that we have the ability to move past that. The idea that events may look like coincidence, but in fact, it is the result of causes and conditions that we have created, both through karma and through the idea of interdependence. The fact that relationships are incredibly important, especially for people living in the world, and that we have to find a way that we can engage in healthy relationships that are based in cherishing others and not in a self-cherishing mind. The recognition that small actions often have outsized results, and the fact that perspective matters and that we often are overwhelmed due to us perceiving things not the way they are, but due to perceiving them through a lens of our own hallucination and projection. And lastly, that our mind is incredibly powerful. And when we can focus our mind and use our mind in a meaningful way, that is how we find freedom from suffering. But when we don't focus our mind, when we allow our mind to run in circles around us, to be overwhelmed by afflictions, then that is when we feel the greatest despair. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this gave you some things to think about, some themes, some ideas that are found in this book that go a little bit beyond the pages. That's how I read the book. That's what I get out of it. I'd love to hear what you got out of this book. I'd love to hear what you found in Cujo that gave you something to think about outside of a rabid dog who actually is just a good boy doing his best in a world that is not made for him. That's all I have for today. Thank you for spending some time with me. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.